Hello students, today we have a new lecture in literary criticism and our topic is reader's response criticism, which is one of the modern schools in literary criticism. And as we see the title, it suggests that this new school or theory mainly focuses on the reader. And maybe we have gone through many schools, many other critics from the past, or even in the let's say the Victorian, the new classical period, all these different critics, we saw that they focus either on the text or on the critic himself or the poet. But what about the reader? We see in modern times actually there is a new focus on the reader. So what is it, this new school of criticism? Reader response suggests, of course sometimes it is written like this, reader response, or just like in the title, reader's response. Okay, both are correct. Reader response suggests that the role of the reader is essential to the meaning of a text, for only in the reading experience does the literary work comes alive. Actually, this is very I think it's common sense. I mean, when a poet, a writer, a novelist, whoever he is, when he's writing certain work, how does this work becomes recognized as a literary work? Because there are readers for this work, someone who reads the work. If it is a play, there is someone who watches the play as it is performed. So there should be an audience. Without audience, how can any work of literature come alive? Or how can you consider this is a work of literature if there is no reader? So it's really important and crucial to think of the reader. That's where this the basics of this theory comes from. The importance of having an audience for your work of literature. So the role of the reader or audience of a literary work or performance has been recognized since classical times. Of course, it is not something new, totally new. We can trace it back to the times even of the Greek culture. Even when we studied Plato and Aristotle, if you remember, there are certain parts of their theories or their ideas that focused on the reader, but not as what we are going to see now, of course, in this new concept. But what is this classical interest in the reader? What was it like? For example, with Plato, you remember, of course, Plato was acutely aware of the disturbing power of poetry to affect people at the level of their passions and morality. We all remember how Plato was against literature, or he actually had this negative attitude towards literature and poetry because he believed that it ruins, it undermines people's morality. It can go through their conscious minds and it can ruin their way of thinking. Okay, it speaks to their passions, and this is not something good because people must be as rational as possible. So in Plato's theory we can see some kind of interest in the reader, the experience of the reader. Okay, as well as their basic conceptions of the gods and indeed of reality itself. So Plato, although his attitude was against the influence of literature, but we can say this is one of the first interest in literary theory concerning readers and why is it important to think about the readers. Okay, he saw poetry as appealing to our lower natures, disposing us toward irrational behavior and distracting us from the rational pursuit of truth. Okay, but what about Aristotle? And of course when we speak about Aristotle, we are talking about his definition of the tragedy, because we all know that the Greek culture was mainly defined by performances, making these live performances in front of an audience. So it was really important to notice how the audience are reacting to these tragedies. So Aristotle made the response of the audience an integral component of his famous definition of a properly structured tragedy. Such a tragedy must inspire the purgative emotions. You remember the part of this definition of tragedy was about the catharsis. You remember this term, catharsis? What is the intended influence that the tragedy should produce in the audience? So actually, this is another example of how the classical period was really interested in the response from the audience towards the literary work. And you remember in the definition that Aristotle said that the final result should be a catharsis. What is a catharsis? It is a kind of purging for the emotions, making the audience sympathize with the tragic hero, making them purify their own feelings and emotions by feeling fear and pity towards the characters, towards the tragic hero. So this is again another example of the interest in the response of the reader. But what is so distinguished or different about this new theory? Now we are talking about the modern interest in the reader. Let's see how it is shaped. So the reader response theory is a school of criticism which emerged in the 1970s. Actually, it's not very old. Focused on finding meaning in the act of reading itself and examining the ways individual readers or communities of readers experience texts. These critics raise theoretical questions regarding how the reader joins with the author to help the text mean. Because the experience of reading literature involves two elements or two sides: the side of the author and the side of the reader. And we all know, or maybe we have all had this kind of idea, especially when we are in literature classes. For example, I personally hear such questions from my students. Sometimes when I explain certain poems, they ask me, how do you know that this is what the author means? And this is a question that's typically asked sometimes. So my answer most of the time is that actually we cannot know, really. For sure, we are not able to go inside the head of this author and understand exactly why he said this, why he wrote this poem like this, or this novel like that. What does he mean by this? Of course, we are not able to do that. But this is our experience as readers. And when the author means something and we try to figure out what he means, this experience, this interaction between the reader and the author helps give the text meaning, not just one meaning, many or different, several meanings. And there are possible meanings. Maybe you come out with a certain understanding of the text that the author maybe couldn't imagine. Maybe he meant something else, but you as a reader, because you have your own experience, you have your own thoughts, you have your own background, you came up with another meaning or other understanding. You see, sometimes ancient works that have been studied and analyzed for hundreds of times, I mean, by many critics and authors, still till now some readers read these poems or read these works and analyze them and come out with new understandings and readings. Okay, so this experience seems to be ever growing. It's not something that comes to an end. Okay, they determine what kind of reader or what community of readers the work implies and helps to create. They also may examine the significance of the series of interpretations the reader undergoes in the reading process, because sometimes you read a text, you understand something in the beginning, but as you go on, as you read more, your interpretation starts to change. And I want to point here to an important point, especially when we said here something community of readers, this term. Look at this term, sorry. Community of readers. Actually, this is interesting. I want to change the color because it's not a good one. Okay, so just to point it out, community of readers. What do you mean by community of readers? You see, sometimes the interpretation of a text is influenced by the understanding of an individual reader, but other times it is because of the community of readers that a certain text is interpreted in a certain way. What does this mean? It means that as a person, as an individual, you belong to a certain community. Okay? Maybe you are part of a cultural, social, economic community that influences the way you understand certain things. So when you are reading, your understanding may be affected by the context of your community. Maybe it's affected by the context of your culture. You interpret it in a certain way. Maybe you are reading a text that is from the West. You, as for example, if you are a student living in the Middle East or in Asia, and you are reading a text coming from Europe, from the West, from America, maybe, your understanding or your interpretation could be largely influenced by the community you are living in, and also the community of readers, how you as readers interpret certain text, or how you place it in the context of your own culture and in your own community. Okay, so actually this concept and theory, it is much deeper than that, and there are many theories. Maybe if you are interested to read more about it, you can go back to Stanley Fish, for example. He's one of the theorists about this idea of the readers' community. So if you want to read further, you can search for Stanley Fish, if you know how to pronounce it, Stanley Fish. Okay. Like in new critics, reader response critics focus on what texts do. But instead of regarding texts as self-contained entities, reader response criticism plunges into what the new critics call the effective fallacy. So actually, they are somehow similar to the new critics. You remember the new critics, new criticism, which focused mainly on the text as a self-entity. They focused on the structure of the text. There is no need to know anything about the author. There is no need to consider his personal experiences. We deal with the text as an organ alone. Okay? Somehow they are similar, but instead of regarding text as self-contained entities, the reader response plunges into what the new critics call the affective fallacy. There's this term that comes with the new criticism. What do texts do in the minds of the readers? In fact, a text can exist only as activated by the mind of the reader. This is really interesting if you think about it. That imagine that a writer is writing a certain text and nobody reads it. Imagine you are an author and you are writing this poem, but there is no one who reads, who, for example, accept to read your poem. You show it to others. You show it to others in order to read it for you, maybe to give a certain response, but nobody actually is interested maybe in reading it. So what happens to your work? What happens to your poem? It seems that it doesn't exist. Why? Because there are no readers to appreciate or even to have a certain response towards it. See, so what they are trying to do here is that, okay, you say that a text is self-contained, but this text cannot exist unless there is a mind that processes its existence, a mind that reads it and analyzes it and comes up with a certain understanding of this text. Actually, this is really interesting to think about it like this. Okay. So it holds that meaning does not reside in the text. Don't go looking for meaning in the text alone. How can a text have meaning alone without having a mind that process this meaning or give it a meaning or come out with a certain meaning? Okay, meanings don't just exist alone in this text or in that text. You give meaning to these things. Your mind give meaning. The active thing here in this process is the mind, the mind of the reader. Okay, but in the mind of the reader, the text functions only as a canvas into which the reader projects whatever his or her reaction may be. The text is a cause of different thoughts, but does not provide a reason for one interpretation rather than the other. Okay, that's why we have different meanings when we have different readers. You see, this is what the point is raised here. This is the point, that as long as we have different readers who have different thoughts, who project their own reactions towards text, then you will see that a text could have different meanings. Each one is not similar to the other one. Okay, so it's not easy to give just one interpretation for a text as long as there are many readers. Of course, there are many critiques against this theory, because as you see, it gives kind of relativism. I mean, as if the theorists of this criticism, they are saying that the meaning of any text is relative. So there are as many meanings as there are readers. This is what could be understood, but of course we see that we have different responses to this theory. If you go and read other sources concerning the modern schools of criticism, you will see actually that there are certain responses towards the idea of having a theory at all in literature, and these are connected. Of course, if you are a student in a PhD program maybe, or an MA program, you would be interested to read more about this. So thank you for listening. I hope that this was a helpful lecture for you. Thank you.